Hey, Sip and Talkers. It's your host, Joe, and with me as always, Sunny. I had kind of a crazy weekend.
Oh, yeah. What happened?
I decided, hey, you know what? I'm gonna bake a cake from scratch.
Ambitious.
Right. Turns out scratch involved setting off the smoke alarm twice.
Oh, no.
Like, really makes you think about how some things can seem really simple.
Yeah.
But then you get under the hood and they're way more complicated than you realize.
Laughing.
It's amazing how quickly a small problem can become a much larger problem.
And speaking of ambitious problems today, we are diving into some seriously wild stuff.
Oh.
Some folks online in China have been chatting about the possibility of, get this, attacking Australia.
Whoa.
Like, not just a trade war or some diplomats yelling at each other.
Right.
Full on, like, hypothetical military action.
That's something.
Yeah, and so we've been doing some digging.
Of course. We got some YouTube transcripts of military analysis videos and some news reports from Taiwanese media, and it's really interesting.
What have you found?
Well, we want to try to understand what's behind this online chatter.
Okay.
Like, why are people even talking about this?
Right.
And then we'll take a realistic look at, how likely any of this is to actually happen based on what we know.
Sounds good.
And don't worry, we're not going to bog you down with a bunch of technical jargon.
Elf.
Think of us as your friendly guides to this crazy corner of the internet.
I like it.
So first up, what exactly are these people saying online?
Well, there's this YouTube video we found, and it has a pretty dramatic title. Something like, "Is China going to ditch Taiwan and attack Australia instead?" Yeah. And this video talks about how some Chinese naval ships, including this pretty advanced destroyer, were sailing between Australia and New Zealand and did some live fire exercises that got some people online riled up.
Makes sense.
Makes sense.
I mean, if another country was doing military exercises off the coast of California, I'd be a little freaked out.
Yeah, I think anyone would be.
So this video also mentions this guy called famous pink blogger Lai Gi.
What's a pink blogger?
So apparently that's slang for these super nationalistic voices online in China.
Oh, okay.
And this Lai Gi dude, he lays out a bunch of reasons why China should go after Australia.
Like what?
Well, he talks about, like, settling old colonial scores.
Okay.
Giving China more space to breathe. They've got a ton of people, and they're kind of squeezed in there.
Yeah, I can see that.
And he also says Australia is just a puppet of the U.S., which, honestly, we've heard that before.
Right, so why not just cut the strings, he's saying?
Yeah, basically.
It's all pretty extreme stuff.
Yeah, it is. But what's really interesting is how these kinds of opinions can spread so fast online.
Yeah.
And how they reflect or maybe even amplify what a lot of people are thinking.
That's true. The internet can be an echo chamber sometimes.
For sure. So this video also talks about some discussions happening on Chinese social media platforms like Guancha and Zhihu.
What are those?
They're like Chinese versions of Twitter and Reddit. They see all these posts calling for China to, like, take back Australia.
Seriously?
Yeah, and there's even this weird idea about Chinese people helping the yellow people in Australia fight against the British.
That's kind of a strange mix of current events and ancient history.
Yeah, totally. And
yeah.
Some people are even saying taking Australia would be easier than dealing with Taiwan.
That's a bold statement.
Yeah, it's like super confident or maybe just completely delusional.
It's hard to tell sometimes online.
So we've got this online buzz, all right. But what are the actual reasons people are giving for why China should attack Australia?
Well, one of the big ones is resources.
Resources make sense.
Australia is huge, like almost the same size as the mainland U.S. and just a bit smaller than China.
Yeah, Australia is massive.
But here's the thing, it only has like 26 million people.
That's it.
Yeah, that's about the same as Taiwan, but spread out over a whole continent.
So they see that as a plus.
Big time less people to deal with, more land to grab.
Especially when you compare that to China, which has way more people and way less space.
Exactly. And then there's the mineral wealth Australia has.
Oh, yeah. Australia's got a lot of valuable stuff in the ground, right?
Tons of it. They're a top global supplier for iron ore, lithium, aluminum, copper, gold, silver, uranium, you name it.
I actually didn't realize they had that much.
And get this, about 60% of Australia's exports to China are minerals.
So they're pretty dependent on each other.
Yeah, and that worries some people in China that if Australia sides with the U.S. too much, they could lose access to all those resources.
That would be a huge blow to China's industries.
For sure.
The video we were talking about even mentions the idea of building houses all over Australia.
Really?
Yeah, like to help with China's housing problems.
That's a wild idea.
Talk about thinking big.
What's the next reason then?
Well, another big one is that there are a lot of Chinese people living in Australia.
Oh, yeah, I've heard about that.
Including a good chunk of what they call the red second generation and the official second generation.
What does that mean?
Basically, people whose families are connected to the Chinese Communist Party or government officials.
Interesting.
Potentially even relatives of some of the top leaders.
So the idea is that taking Australia would somehow protect those people.
Yeah, and it would also solve what some see as this contradiction of Chinese officials sending their families to live in Western countries while being publicly anti-West.
It's a strange kind of logic.
Totally. Like, they're saying, we're not sending our kids to enemy territory. We're just going to make that territory ours.
I guess that makes sense in a twisted kind of way.
There are about 1.4 million Chinese Australians. That's like 5.5% of the population.
That's a significant number.
And some people believe that a good chunk of them would be pro-Beijing.
That's a big assumption to make.
The video even compares it to the recent cases of Chinese-American soldiers leaking U.S. military secrets.
Whoa, suggesting there might be insiders in Australia who could help with an invasion.
Exactly. It's a pretty serious claim.
It is.
Okay, so we've got resources, we've got the Chinese population in Australia. What's the third reason?
Well, a lot of the talk online focuses on the Australian military.
What about it?
Some people believe it's weak and wouldn't be able to put up much of a fight.
Really?
Yeah, the Australian army is pretty small, only about 17,000 personnel, and just a few brigades that are ready for combat.
That does sound small.
Especially when you compare it to China's PLA, which has hundreds of brigades, including tons of heavy armor and a big airborne force.
I remember seeing a video of their tanks doing drills. It was pretty impressive.
They've been putting a lot of resources into modernizing their military.
The video even talks about a scenario where the PLA just airdrops troops into major Australian cities and takes over the country in a week.
That seems overly optimistic.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like Australia is completely defenseless.
Exactly. They've got the Royal Australian Navy and the Royal Australian Air Force.
So what do those look like?
Their Navy has some modern destroyers, amphibious landing ships, and pretty advanced frigates.
Okay.
And their Air Force has F-35 fighter jets, FA-18s, and E-7 Wedgetail early warning aircraft.
Those are all top of the line.
Yeah, they're not messing around.
But China's military is rapidly getting stronger too, right?
Oh, absolutely. They've been building up their Navy like crazy. They've got 2 aircraft carriers now, multiple big amphibious assault ships, and a ton of new destroyers.
So they could probably put together a pretty formidable invasion force?
On paper, yeah.
But
there's a big difference between having a lot of ships and planes and actually being able to use them effectively in a real fight.
That's true.
Australia and their allies, like the U.S., have a lot more experience, and their technology is generally more advanced.
So it's not just about numbers?
Not at all.
All right, so we've got the resources, the Chinese population in Australia, and this perception that Australia's military is weak. Anything else?
Yeah, there's also this big strategic reason that gets brought up a lot.
Control of the South Pacific.
Okay.
The idea is that if China takes Australia, they become the dominant power in the region. And that could lead to other countries like New Zealand, the Philippines, Indonesia falling in line.
Like a domino effect?
Yeah, exactly. And there are even some people comparing it to Japan's Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere from World War II.
Wait, seriously?
Yeah, it's pretty disturbing. They draw these parallels between Australia and Taiwan and Pearl Harbor in South Korea.
That's messed up.
It is, and it shows a real lack of understanding about history and the complexities of international relations.
And it's not just about controlling the region, right?
No, there's also this why not Australia argument.
What's that?
Basically, the idea is that since the U.S. would probably get involved if China attacked Taiwan, why not go for Australia instead?
Because it's a bigger prize.
Yeah, it's like they're saying, if we're going to gamble, let's go for the jackpot.
But that's based on the assumption that they could actually win that gamble.
And that the rest of the world would just sit back and watch.
Which seems pretty unlikely. Thankfully, the video we've been talking about does acknowledge that there's a huge gap between these online fantasies and the reality of trying to pull off an invasion of Australia.
So let's talk about that reality check.
Okay.
What are the biggest obstacles that make this whole idea so improbable?
Well, the most obvious one is logistics.
Right. Just getting troops and equipment over there would be a nightmare.
It would be a logistical nightmare. The distance between China and Australia is enormous, over 4,000 kilometers.
That's like sailing from Los Angeles to Hawaii and then doing it again.
Yeah, and then some. And China's ability to keep a large force supplied over that distance is really limited.
Their navy is getting bigger, But it's still mostly focused on operating close to home, right?
Yeah, their fleet of support ships is still pretty small. The video mentions that a recent deployment of just 2 warships to the region needed a dedicated supply ship just to keep them going.
And that was just 2 ships. Imagine trying to support an entire invasion force.
It would be incredibly difficult.
And what about Australia's allies?
That's another major problem for China. Australia has the ANZUS treaty.
What's that?
It's a mutual defense pact with the United States and New Zealand.
So if someone attacks Australia, the U.S. has to come to their aid.
Exactly. And that makes attacking Australia a very risky move for China.
No kidding. The U.S. military is nothing to mess with.
The video even suggests that the U.S. Navy's nuclear submarines alone could sink a Chinese invasion fleet before it even got close to Australia.
Wow, that's a scary thought.
Submarines are a serious threat, and the U.S. has the most advanced submarine fleet in the world.
So the waters around Australia would be pretty dangerous for a Chinese invasion fleet.
Absolutely.
The video also mentioned how long it took that recent Chinese naval deployment to reach Australia.
Yeah, it took them about 2 weeks to sail from the South China Sea to the east coast of Australia.
That's a long time to be out in the open.
It is, and it makes them very vulnerable to attack, especially from submarines.
What about anti-submarine warfare?
That's another area where the PLA Navy has traditionally been weaker than the U.S. and its allies.
So they'd have a hard time defending themselves against submarines.
Yeah, they've relied on smaller helicopters with limited sonar technology, while the U.S. and Australia have much more advanced systems.
Okay, so we've established that getting to Australia would be difficult and dangerous.
Yeah.
What about once they're there?
Well, then they'd have to deal with the Australian Air Force.
And we talked about how they've got some pretty advanced jets, right?
Yeah, their F-35s are a real problem for China.
How so?
Well, for one thing, they're stealthy, which means they're harder to detect on radar.
And that gives them a big advantage in air-to-air combat.
Yeah, they can basically sneak up on enemy aircraft and shoot them down before they even know they're there.
And China's carrier-based fighters can't really compete with that?
Not at the moment. Their J-15s are older and less capable.
And they also have those E-7 wedge-tail early warning aircraft, right?
Yeah, those are basically flying radar stations that can detect enemy aircraft from very far away.
So they'd be able to see a Chinese attack coming from a long way off.
Exactly. And that would give the Australian Air Force time to scramble their fighters and get into position to defend themselves.
It sounds like the people who are talking about attacking Australia online might be underestimating their opponents.
I think that they definitely are. They seem to be focusing on the size of China's military and ignoring the quality of Australia's forces and their alliances.
It's like they're stuck in a video game mentality where whoever has the most units wins.
And that's just not how the real world works.
The video even compares it to Japan's attack on Darwin in World War II.
Yeah, it's a good analogy. Japan had some early successes, but they overreached and ultimately lost the war.
Because they couldn't sustain their offensive?
Exactly. And the video argues that the PLA Navy today might not even be able to project enough force beyond the South China Sea to pose a real threat to Australia.
So even getting there would be a stretch.
It would be a huge stretch.
So all this talk about attacking Australia is mostly just bluster then?
It seems that way, but it's still worth paying attention to because it reveals something about the mindset of certain segments of Chinese society.
Like what?
Well, it shows that there's a strong current of nationalism and a desire to assert China's power on the world stage.
And a willingness to use force to achieve those goals.
Yeah, even if it's not realistic in this particular case.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Our sources also mentioned some recent Chinese naval activity near Australia and New Zealand.
Right. There were reports of a Chinese fleet conducting live-fire exercises in the Tasman Sea.
That's between Australia and New Zealand.
Yeah, and apparently the Australian military only found out about it because a Virgin Australia pilot saw them and reported it.
Wait, seriously?
Yeah, they only got 40 minutes notice.
That's not very reassuring.
It does raise some concerns about Australia's ability to detect and track Chinese naval movements.
So what were those ships doing there?
Well, experts believe it was a show of force by China.
Like they were trying to send a message?
Exactly. They wanted to demonstrate their ability to operate far from home and to challenge the U.S. and its allies in the region.
And what was the Australian response?
Well, they expressed concern about the lack of notice, and they've been talking about strengthening their defenses.
Like what kinds of defenses?
They're looking at deploying new anti-ship missiles that can hit targets from much farther away.
So they're taking the threat seriously.
They are.
Our sources also mentioned a Chinese research vessel operating near Australia.
Oh, yeah, that was an interesting case.
What was going on there?
This Chinese research vessel was spotted sailing through Australia's exclusive economic zone.
And that's the area where they have special rights to resources and stuff, right?
Exactly. And there were concerns that this ship was actually engaged in intelligence gathering.
Spying.
Basically, yeah. They were probably trying to collect information on Australian military activities and infrastructure.
And what did Australia do about it?
They monitored the ship very closely and made it clear that they weren't happy about it.
So they're pushing back against China's assertiveness.
They are. They're not just going to sit back and let China do whatever it wants in their backyard.
Okay, now, for something really wild, one of our sources mentioned some Chinese netizens claiming that Australia historically belonged to China.
Oh, yeah, that's a whole other level of crazy.
Like, what's the basis for that claim?
Well, they point to things like the voyages of the Ming Dynasty in the 15th century.
But those were just explorations, right?
Yeah, they didn't establish any permanent settlements or anything.
So it's a pretty flimsy claim.
It is, but it's an example of how historical narratives can be twisted to serve political agendas.
And this isn't just some fringe idea, is it?
No, the Jamestown Foundation, which is a pretty reputable think tank, published a report on this.
And they're worried about it.
Yeah, they're concerned that this kind of extreme nationalist thinking is becoming more common among young, educated Chinese.
And that could have serious implications for the future.
Exactly. If those people come to power, they might be more likely to pursue aggressive foreign policies.
So all this online chatter about attacking Australia might be a sign of things to come.
It's definitely something to keep an eye on.
So what has the Australian government been saying about all this?
Their representative in Sydney has been pretty outspoken.
What have they said?
They've accused China of military bullying, and they've called for democratic countries to stand together against it.
So they're trying to rally support.
Yeah, they're trying to build a coalition to counter China's growing influence.
And are other countries listening?
Well, Australia and New Zealand have both expressed concern about China's military exercises in the Taiwan Strait.
So they're on the same page.
Yeah, they see China as a threat to the regional order.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. What are the key takeaways for our listeners?
I think the main takeaway is that while there is some online chatter about China attacking Australia, it's highly unlikely to happen.
Because of all the reasons we've talked about.
Exactly. The logistics, the alliances, the military balance of power.
It's just not a realistic scenario.
No, and it's important to remember that these online discussions don't represent the official views of the Chinese government.
Right. They're just a small but vocal minority.
But it's still worth paying attention to because it gives us a glimpse into the mindset of certain segments of Chinese society.
And it shows that there are some deep-seated anxieties about China's place in the world.
And a willingness to use force to achieve their goals.
Which is something that we all need to be aware of.
Absolutely.
So what's the final thought you want to leave our listeners with?
Well, I think it's the gap between the online rhetoric and the reality on the ground is huge.
Yeah, we've seen that.
And it makes you wonder how much of this talk about attacking Australia is just posturing.
Like they're trying to scare people?
Maybe, or maybe they're just trying to work through their own anxieties about China's future.
It's hard to say for sure.
It is, but it's something worth thinking about.
Absolutely. All right, before we wrap up, we want to give a shout out to our friend Micky.
Oh, yeah, Micky.
You can find his YouTube channel, Mickytolife.
What's he all about?
He does travel vlogs, whiskey and alcohol unboxings, and some really chill background music.
Sounds like a good time.
Go check him out if you're looking for something fun and relaxing.
Will do.
All right, that's all for today, folks. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.